kitchen. Now, before I get started on this week's video tutorial, I wanted to say a massive thank you to all of you. This week on the Cake Spaniards YouTube channel, we reached 400,000 subscribers, which is so amazing. So I wanted to say a huge welcome to anyone who's new to the channel, and a massive thank you if you've been around for a while, for watching the tutorials, liking the videos, and for leaving comments. It really does mean so much to me every week, so thank you so much. Now, to celebrate, I thought it'd be really fun to show you how I made this giant cupcake. Now, this cupcake is covered in fondant, but I've made it to look like it's got the cupcake case, the cake sponge, and it's covered in this really pretty buttercream swirl. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing I'm gonna need to do in order to make my giant cupcake is bake my cakes. And for this, I'm using my giant cupcake tin, and this one is by Wilton. Now, this is made of metal, but you can get silicone alternatives. This tin will give me two halves. I've got the base of my cake, and as you can see, it's got the shape of a cupcake case around the edge. And this one measures around 5 inches at the base. It comes up 3.5 inches and is around 6 inches across the top. I've then got the top. This one measures 7 inches across and is around 3.5 inches in height, and it comes into this point. Now, even though they are together, I do tend to bake the bottom first and then the top. The reason for this is the bottom of my cake is a lot bigger than the top, so it holds a lot more mixture, meaning if I try and bake them at the same time, the top of my cake is gonna burn. Now, I'm gonna be starting with the side that is gonna create the base of my cupcake. Now, I've used my tin quite a few times, and it's always a little bit hit and miss in how well this one is going to turn out. The reason is you've got this quite awkward shape, and I have seen videos where people just turn it upside down and the cake falls out. I'm never that lucky, and I always end up losing part of my cake and it stays in the cake tin. So in order to combat this, I've first of all drawn round the base of my tin just on a piece of parchment paper, and I've cut this out. I've then got 3 other pieces of parchment paper. So these are just rectangles, and I've cut a slight curve on the bottom so that I can wrap it around the inside. I'm gonna start by taking butter, running this all the way over the tin just to help my parchment paper stick. Now, if you find just greasing your tins and dusting them with flour, or maybe using one of the cake release sprays works fine for you, then you don't have to do this step. You can just add in your cake mixture. I can then take the circle of parchment paper, push that into the bottom. I can then take these, place them on the bottom, and just push them into those grooves. So I've added my parchment paper all the way around, so my tin is completely covered, but we still have those grooves coming up the side. So it's now time to add my cake mixture. I'm using my vanilla sponge cake recipe, and I will put the quantities in the description below. I'm gonna smooth that out and pop it in my oven to bake. Once our cake has been baked, flip that over, and we've got our giant cupcake, and I can remove the parchment paper. Now, for the top, it's not as easy to cover this in parchment paper, so I'm gonna start by covering all of those grooves with some butter, and I'm gonna dust this with some flour to stop that sticking. I've then cut out a few strips of parchment paper. So these are quite long and are 1 centimeter in width. Now, what I find with these, if I do have any problems at getting my cake out, then I can just slightly pull on these just to help me release that. And I can then carefully pour in my cake mixture. Smoothing that down, keeping those bits of parchment paper out of the way, I'm gonna pop that in the oven. And there we've got the top of our cupcake. Now, all I need to do is just remove those pieces of parchment paper. So I left my cakes to cool, and I wrapped them in cling film and popped them in the fridge for a few hours. This just allows them to firm up, so they're a lot easier to cut. They will then, once they return back to room temperature, become nice and soft and fluffy again. So starting with the base of my cake, I want to trim off the top so it's nice and flat. Now, this is quite a deep cake, so what I'm also going to do is cut this into 2. Now, because I want that to go back in exactly the same place when I add my buttercream, take a cocktail stick, push that into my top layer. I'm then gonna push the other cocktail stick below that so that I know when I restack it, I need those to be above each other. Now on the top, I'm just leveling that off. Now I'm gonna place this on top of my base, and as you can see, there's a little bit of overhang. If you were covering the top with buttercream rosettes, for example, you could leave this exactly how it is. Because I wanna cover this in fondant to make it look like a real cupcake, I need to blend these two layers together. Okay, so before I fill my cake with my buttercream, I'm also gonna trim down my top layer just so that I can add some buttercream into there. I'm going to be filling this with some of my vanilla buttercream, and I will put a link in the description below to the recipe for that. Now this is entirely up to you, but because I am going to be adding fondant onto the top of my cake, I'm going to add a few dowels and a cake board in. So for this I've got a 5-inch just a thin cake board, and I'm also going to be using the new square easy dowels. So I'm just going to add in 3 dowels. Now ordinarily I wouldn't add dowels into a giant cupcake because it is just a 4-layer cake. But because I am going to be adding in quite a lot of weight onto the top with my fondant, and the cake does slightly taper down, so it's a lot thinner at the bottom, I'm just adding in some dowels. So I know that cake isn't going to push down on the lower layers, and just push it out that buttercream slightly. Because of the shape of my cake, to smooth that buttercream out, I'm going to be using my flexi smoothers, just curving that round. And if you don't have flexi smoothers, you could just use a piece of acetate or even a piece of cardboard. Now on the top, I'm smoothing that out so we don't have the grooves that were created with our cupcake tin. But on the bottom, I do want to keep the shape of the case. So with a really small palette knife, I'm going in at the bottom, just making sure that those grooves aren't filled completely with my buttercream. So we're getting that shape of the cupcake case. So I'm going to pop my cake in the fridge for that buttercream to firm up so that I can cover it in my fondant. For my cake, I'm going to keep it quite pink, but you can do yours in any colour to match your theme. I've got a dark pink fondant for my cupcake case, an ivory fondant for the cake itself, and a light pink fondant for the frosting that's going to go on the top. So I'm going to be starting with the ivory colour and creating the cake around the edge. And that buttercream has firmed up, so I'm going to apply a really thin layer just so I can attach my fondant. Now I'm going to be using the ivory to look like the sponge cake itself, so I want it to come from the top of my cupcake case and bring it round onto the top of my cupcake, starting by rolling out my ivory fondant. And because I don't want this covering the whole of the top of my cake, as this is going to be covered in fondant that looks like frosting, I'm going to use my large circle cookie cutter, and this one measures just under 4 inches in diameter. I can then drape that over the top of the cake, smoothing that down. I've still got quite a lot on the top, so I'm going to cut away more of that fondant. Now around the bottom, we want to trim where it meets the top of our cupcake case, just where it starts to turn in. So to get the texture of the cake, I'm going to start with a piece of tin foil. I can then use this as a texture tool to go over the top, pushing in some dents. You can then go in with a Dresden tool, add in some small areas, so just moving that fondant around, adding in a few grooves. To make this look like it's been baked in the oven, I'm going to use some edible tints. So I've got some cream edible tint by Sugar Flare and also a small amount of chocolate brown. So using my fluffy brush, I'm going to start with the cream and just add that in at the bottom, just coming up. And if you didn't have edible tint and you prefer airbrushing, you could also airbrush some colour on. You can then mix a small amount of the chocolate brown with that cream and just use that in certain areas just to bring out some of that detail. Now for the case, I'm going to use the dark pink fondant, and I'm going to start by rolling this into a strip. So rolling that out, pushing it back in so that it doesn't get too wide, and I'm going to trim it down. So just doing one straight edge and then marking in about 3 1/4 inches. I'm then going to trim off a straight edge at one end and just really carefully roll this up. Now before I add on my fondant, I'm just going to go around the edge, just marking in where that case is going to come to. To help it stick, I've mixed some icing sugar with a small amount of water just to make a glue, which I'm going to just run along that edge Now I'm not going to add any more buttercream to the bottom because I don't want to lose the shape that we created with our tin. I can then take my fondant, push that underneath, and I can trim off the excess. I go in, just using my fingers, pushing down those grooves, using the shape of the cake just to guide me as I go. Now around the bottom, I want it to look like it slightly tucks under. So I'm just going to use my finger just to make sure that that fondant is pushed against that edge. I'm then going to take my craft knife and just go in, just following the shape. Use my flexi smoother just to carefully start to push that underneath. So I'm just taking off small amounts at a time so that I can get a nice edge at the bottom. Now to define those a little bit more, I'm going to use the end of my Dresden tool, so not the pointy end, this one that's got a wider scoop on there. Just using that on the edge, just running it from the bottom to the top. Once you're happy with how that's looking, I've got a dark pink edible tint, so this one is a rose. And again, taking my fluffy brush at the bottom, just to create a little bit of shadow. So once you're happy with the case, the next thing to do is work on the frosting that's going to go on the top. I want to make it look like we've used buttercream, but it's actually fondant that looks like a buttercream swirl. In order for my fondant to stick, I'm first of all going to add a thin coating of buttercream over the top. For the swirl, I've got 550 grams of fondant, which I've coloured in this light pink colour. You're also going to need a small rolling pin, or if you've got a fat paintbrush. So this one measures around 1 centimetre in diameter. Now the first thing I'm going to do is to create a little point that's going to go on the top. So as you would usually pull away with your piping tip, it's going to create this little peak. So I've got a ball of fondant, and this one measures around 2 inches in diameter. I'm going to taper that down and just push that on my work surface. I'm then going to take my rolling pin and just push into the side, and as I push it in, I'm just turning that slightly so we're getting this curve, and I'm going to put 4 of those in, going around the outside of our cone, and then start to twist that fondant and bring it into a point. And I don't want it to dry out, so I've just got a piece of cling film, so I'm going to lightly wrap that. And then take the rest of my fondant, and I want to roll this out into quite a fat sausage, just over 1 inch in diameter, and slightly flatten that down. Turn it on its side, and using a knife, just cut that directly in half, so we've got 2 pieces exactly the same size. So this is around 20 inches. I'm going to pop down some corn flour just to stop it sticking. Now, taking my small rolling pin, I want to put diagonal grooves all the way along. Placing my rolling pin against the edge, push in, and as I roll, I'm also going to twist it at the same time. Move along around 1 centimetre and do exactly the same thing. I can then go in, and the section that's raised, run my fingers along, just defining that, so bringing it up into a point, and I'm going to work my way all the way along. Now, they don't have to be exactly the same, so you could leave a slightly bigger gap or maybe twist it a bit more. We just want it so that when it's placed on the cake, it looks like the buttercream has come out of a piping nozzle. So here we have our first length. I'm then going to do exactly the same on the other piece. So there we have our 2 pieces. Now, if you imagine piping a swirl on a cupcake, you would do 1 rotation round, and then when you meet the side, you'll come up slightly onto your previous row, go round and then into a point in the center. So I'm going to start with my first length. I can then start to lift that up and just stick that onto the side of my cupcake. I'm going to carefully bring that round, bring that into place. When I meet the back, bring that up. Now I'm going to get that into position, so I'm not actually pushing it onto the cupcake. I'm keeping it slightly further off. If there are any parts along the bottom that came apart, just use your Dresden tool to go in and smooth those out. So just repairing any rips. And you can use some water underneath to stick any areas down. So there we've got our first swirl of buttercream. So now I'm going to join my second piece on and create my next row. Roughly popping it in place before I tuck this under, just pull it round. Once we've wrapped that around, I'm going to take my centerpiece and just start to pull that out. I can tuck that inside. What I then want to do is blend some of the areas together. So again, just using my rolling pin, I'm going to go in and just use this to create some definition, blend out any of those areas. So I'm just brushing on a small amount of water, which is going to make those pieces stick together. So working my way around, smoothing out any areas I feel need smoothing. I'm still trying to keep the different rows. So all I'm doing is going in, blending with the end of my rolling pin and also with the two ends of my Dresden tool, smoothing down that fondant, really blending it together so it looks like we've created a swirl on the top of our cupcake. Now I'm going to add a little bit of shadow with some edible tint. So I've just got some blush pink and some dusky pink, and I'm going to use this just in some of those grooves, just really blending that through. And once you're happy with how that's looking, we can then work on the board that this is going to sit on. Now for the board, I've got a 10-inch drum board, so this is going to give me room to add my cake and also add some text around the front of my cake. Just covering this with some white fondant, adding some water onto my board to make sure that sticks, trimming off any excess and smoothing that down. I've then finished off the board with a really pretty light pink satin ribbon. Now these cupcakes are great for birthdays, and this might mean you want to add a name onto your board. Now a great way to do this is you can either use cutters, or I've got some of the sweet stamp sets here. Now if you watched the intro, you would have seen that this week the Cakes by Lynn's YouTube channel hit 400,000 subscribers. So I thought instead of adding a name, it would be great to add that onto the board so that we can remember this milestone. Now first of all, I've got the number set from the Sweet Sticks, and this one just matches their Sweet Sticks letter set. I've then got the Cutie Pie set, which just has the cutest little K. So what I'm going to do is do the 40 first and then come back in and do the 0 and the K. So I've placed those where I want on my board. I've then got the pickup pad. So I'm going to place this over the top, push my numbers in. You can remove those. I'm going to place down second 0 and also add in the K. Now you can then go in with a small paintbrush and some edible paint and paint in your numbers. I'm actually going to be using the Sweet Stamp Perfect Pour bottles just to make it a lot quicker. So I've got the little bottle that you get, and it has this fine point on the top. Remove the lid, and I've got some of the Hot Pink Luster Dust by Sweet Stick, and to that I'm going to add some dipping solution. So this is going to make it into a paint. And really carefully just come over my letters and allow some of that edible paint to drip out. I can then use the tip of the Perfect Pour bottle just to push that into those embossed numbers. And when you've done the first number, just make sure none is dripping off before you lift away. So there we have our first number. I can then work my way along. And don't forget, I will put a link in the description below to all the tools that I've used throughout today's video. So you just want to leave that until that has completely dried. I'm going to have the cake slightly towards the back, pop down some buttercream to enable it to stick. Carefully use my offset spatulas. Now, what cupcake would be complete without sprinkles? But I do need to make them quite large so they look like normal size in comparison to my cupcake. So I've got two sets of happy sprinkles here. The first one is some medium choco balls, and these ones are in lilac. So as you can see, they're quite large balls. And I've also got the Colour Up mix. This one just has a variety of different sprinkles inside. I've got these really pretty matte purple balls. And there's also some white stars. Take in some edible glue, place that on the cake, and just stick some of those sprinkles in place. So here we have the finished giant cupcake that looks like it's got this pink cupcake case at the bottom and this pink frosting swirl on the top. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and will be able to use it to make your own giant cupcake. If you have enjoyed the video, as always, don't forget to give the video a like. And if you'd like to see more videos like this and you haven't already, then don't forget you can subscribe to the Cakes by Lynn's YouTube channel. You can also hit the notification bell next to the subscribe button, and this will just alert you every time we upload a new video. So until next time, bye!